Hello, and thank you so much for joining me today for our last video in the ethics module. So for this particular video, I'm going to be talking about putting ethics into practice, right? So in the past 3 videos or 4 videos, I've defined ethics for you and talked about various ethical perspectives. I have reviewed famous violations in ethics that have been committed by scientific researchers. I've talked about the Belmont Report and various ethical principles that we are now required to uphold. And in this last video, I'm going to talk about how scientists are required to behave ethically when they conduct research, right? So how do we put these ethical principles um, into practice? All right, so how do we put these ethics into practice? Well, based on my previous video and my discussion of ethical principles and IRB and all of that, you might be under the impression that we're not allowed to study sensitive topics, right? But that's actually not the case. So we're still able to study things like aggression, for example, or pain or things like that have obvious ethical limitations. We just have to be somewhat creative when we're designing laboratory studies that investigate these topics. And we also typically have to investigate them on a smaller scale. So let me show you some examples. Okay, so two of the things we have to consider when we're studying sensitive topics is, again, we have to define them sort of creatively and also make sure to use kind of the tenets of sound research design. So things like informed consent and debriefing and things like that. So obviously with the Tuskegee syphilis study, we saw what happened when there wasn't informed consent. And with the obedience study, we saw Milgram's obedience study, we saw the importance of debriefing, right? So it's very important to include those components. But let me show you some examples of how we might study sensitive topics creatively or on a smaller scale. Okay, so let's suppose we are interested in taboo behaviors or behaviors that are typically punished in our society, right? So two examples of those are cheating and also stealing, right? But obviously, if we were interested in studying these topics, we couldn't require participants to, for example, cheat on an exam or cheat on their taxes, or we certainly couldn't require them to commit some sort of petty theft, right, as part of our experiment, because the ramifications would be too significant for our participants, right? So how do we study these topics in a more controlled laboratory setting? Well, this was something that researchers sought to do in a very famous study in 2014. So Whitaker, Melzer, Steffgen, and Bushman in 2013 decided to create kind of an interesting situation. So to study how people might react to opportunities to be dishonest, researchers gave participants either the opportunity to cheat on a history test, okay, so they could cheat on a history test that was administered in the laboratory, or they could steal quarters, okay? But what was interesting about Whitaker et al.'s study is they presented these opportunities to cheat or steal, but then they withdrew them in the middle of the study, right? So for some participants, they were presented this opportunity and it was later withdrawn, and for control participants, they were never given the opportunity, right? So what they were interested in is how that withdrawal would affect later manifestations of aggression. Okay? So if you were a participant in this experiment in the experimental group, you would either be told that you could steal quarters or that you could cheat on a history test. And then later in the experiment, they would withdraw that opportunity and say, basically, no, just kidding, you can't, right? But how did they study something like aggression, right? Because just like cheating and stealing, aggression is something that could have a lot of negative consequences, right? So obviously we can't just, you know, have participants beat each other up or join a fight club or something like that, right? We have to come up with a more creative, more controlled situation, right? So what they did um, is they wanted to see if withdrawing this opportunity to cheat or steal led to frustration, which would lead to the need for an outlet for aggression, right? So what they did is after they withdrew the opportunity, um, they gave participants the choice of playing video games, right? So they said, okay, you can't cheat on the test or steal these quarters, but here, why don't you play a video game, right? And you can choose between an aggressive video game or a violent video game and a non-violent video game, like a driving video game. Okay, and what they found is that frustrated participants who were denied this opportunity to cheat or steal were way more likely or much more likely to choose the violent video game instead of the non-violent video game, right? So again, what that suggests is that frustration leads to the need for an aggressive outlet, which in this case manifested in the choice to play violent video games. Okay, so an interesting study that tells us a lot about frustration and aggression. Okay, another example, pain, right? So if we want to study the physiological and psychological consequences of pain, we can't obviously get a 2x4 and hit our participants in the head, or at least that would be very unlikely to be sanctioned by the IRB, right? So instead, we have to come up with a creative alternative. And I already mentioned this in one of my early videos, right? But the way that we typically study pain in laboratory is we have participants submerge their hand in cold ice water, which is a very painful experience. And we see, how long they can submerge their hand, their physiological responses when their hand is submerged, and also their subjective experience of the pain. Okay. Lastly, alcohol. So obviously, alcohol or ingestion of alcohol has a lot of significant effects on the body and certainly on your mind psychologically as well. And those could potentially be very dangerous, right? So there's the potential for alcohol poisoning and things like that. So typically when we attempt to study the effects of alcohol, we do so in a controlled setting. And almost all studies looking at alcohol consumption and things like that make sure that participants are exposed to alcohol, but it's in a manageable amount, right? So very rarely would a researcher give you more alcohol than would be at the legal limit, right? So we always make sure your blood alcohol level is within the legal limit, and we have, a supportive structure where if anything were to go wrong, there are people there to assist you, right? So again, we're just thinking about these sensitive topics on a much smaller scale, always with the safety of the participant in mind. Okay, so another way that researchers can put these critical ethical principles into practice is with the ethical treatment of data. Okay, so Diederik Stapel was a Dutch researcher who was incredibly famous, right? So for 10 years, he published many different studies in the top journals in his field. I believe he was a social psychologist. So he was kind of a world-renowned social psychologist, and he published a lot of famous studies that were frequently discussed in the press. So, for example, he published a study showing or alleging that vegetarians, or excuse me, meat eaters, scored much higher on various indices of selfishness than vegetarians, and vegetarians were more altruistic than meat eaters, right? So that was one of his most famous studies that was, again, prominently featured in the press. And then he had another study that showed that if white participants were forced to stay in a unorganized environment for an extended period of time, so if they were shown messy, unorganized environments, that led the white participants to actively discriminate more against black participants, right? So these were very thought-provoking, compelling research studies that again got him a lot of attention from the press and certainly from other researchers. But there was a significant problem. So Diederik Stapel's graduate students started to notice something unusual. And what they noticed is that when they analyzed the data from Stapel's various, studies that he was conducting, they almost never found a significant effect. However, when Diederik Stapel analyzed the data, he would report back, and suddenly there would be these very profound and statistically significant effects. So after a while, after about 10 years of being this prolific researcher, Diederik Stapel's graduate students basically reported him to the dean of the university where he worked and said, we highly suspect that he is either falsifying or completely fabricating the data in his experiments. And indeed, it was found that almost all of the papers that Stapel had published were indeed completely falsified. Okay, so here is a quote from Diederik Stapel. It says, "I failed as a scientist. I adapted research data and fabricated research, not once but several times, not for a short period but over a longer period of time." Okay, so obviously this represents a profound breach of ethics, okay? To completely make up data over an extended period of time is certainly very problematic, okay? But also, there's such a thing as massaging the data, right? So for example, excluding participants from your data that don't follow the pattern that supports your hypothesis would be an example of an unethical treatment of the data, as well as only reporting significant results. Okay, so for example, if you collect data on numerous variables, okay? And most of those variables are not significantly related to whatever construct you're studying, okay? But you only report the ones that are, okay? Or if you conduct an experiment and find an interesting effect, but then when you replicate it, and then you're unable to replicate it. So if you repeat the study over and over and over, and you were only able to find the effect one time, if you were to only report that one experiment and leave out all of your failed replications, that would be an unethical treatment of data. Okay, so both of those are examples of what we would consider unethical practices for research scientists. Okay. We also want to be mindful of how we are presenting data. Okay, so the file drawer problem is essentially the problem that there's a bias in terms of what papers get published, right? So in a study of over 4,600 research articles from various scientific disciplines, a 2012 study found not only a bias toward publishing papers that support the researcher's hypothesis, right, but this bias has become much more extreme over time, right? So this is the file drawer problem, which is basically the idea that scientists everywhere know that they won't be able to publish a study unless it supports their hypothesis, right? So essentially, if they find data that fails to support it, that data goes into a file drawer, if you will, and is never discussed or written up for publication, right? So that's a problem because it gives a very incomplete or false picture of whatever the individual is trying to study, right? So if you only publish significant results, right? So if you conduct 100 studies and only 25 of those produced significant results and they were all within the same domain, right? So let's say you're a researcher on autobiographical memory, right? And you only publish 25 out of 100 of the studies that you've conducted. That's a lot of missing information, right? So anymore, journals have tried to tackle this problem, and in fact, many of the journals where I have published papers actually have a file drawer category. So they actually have issues of their journal that are specifically for experiments that fail to support researchers' hypotheses, right? So we are becoming more mindful of this and trying to solve this problem as best we can as a scientific community. Okay, all right, so this concludes my video series on Module 3, which was a discussion of ethics in psychological science. I hope you enjoyed it, and certainly if you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you in my next video.